In Unit 1.4c, we will explore the basics of government price controls. In some cases, the nature of a particular output or market may result in an outcome that is not efficient. A market may lead to an inefficient outcome in if a market failure occurs. Market failures may provide justification for government intervention in certain markets like agriculture and labor markets. The forces of supply and demand move free markets towards equilibrium, and price is determined by the interaction of individual buyers and sellers. If the resulting price is deemed too high or deemed too small for some buyers in the market, policymakers within government will use this as a justification to set a limit on the price that sellers can charge in order to protect those buyers. Theoretically, in the short run, the free market does not always lead to the best outcomes for all producers, consumers, or the society in general, and so governments intervene in the market to correct the situation. These corrections are called price controls. There are two: price ceilings and price floors, that we'll discuss in detail. We will start with price ceilings. A price ceiling is a maximum legal price for an output, and it is sometimes referred to as a price cap. A binding price ceiling is one that is established below the equilibrium price. It prevents prices from rising above the ceiling price. A price ceiling set above the equilibrium price is non-binding because it does not prevent equilibrium from being obtained. The recent rise in fluctuations in the price of a gallon of gasoline have prompted some to call for a ceiling on the price that sellers can charge for a gallon of gas. Basic supply and demand analysis can be used to show the potential impact of such a policy. Suppose supply and demand conditions in the market for gasoline can be described by the model shown. This market achieves equilibrium at a price of $3.29 per gallon, when both quantity demanded and quantity supplied equal 5,400 gallons, let's probably say in a month. If a price ceiling, or a PC, is established at a price of $2.10 per gallon, quantity supplied falls to 4,800 gallons per month, and quantity demanded increases to 6,100 gallons per month. When quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, there is a market shortage. In this case, the market shortage is equal to 6,100 minus 4,800, which equals a shortage of 1,300 gallons per month. That's huge. When price is below equilibrium and quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, the actual quantity that will be consumed and produced is determined by the quantity supplied, since consumers cannot purchase 6,100 units if there are only 4,800 units for sale. In the 1970s, gasoline became very expensive because of the OPEC cartel, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The members of OPEC, pictured in the upper left, agreed to limit production in order to drive the price of oil upward. U.S. policymakers responded to the upward pressure on global gasoline prices by implementing price ceilings for domestic producers of gasoline. The predictable result was a shortage of gasoline in the United States, illustrated by the long lines at gas stations running out of fuel, while many customers remained in those lines, as you can see. The intent of the price ceiling may be to keep prices low for certain buyers in the market. However, the ceiling is likely to have a negative impact on many buyers in the market, including those it is intended to help. Not only will a binding price ceiling, called binding only if the mandated price prevents market equilibrium from being achieved, leads to shortages. It is likely to lead to an increase in the opportunity cost associated with obtaining the product, like long lines and lost time while waiting in those lines. The development of illegal markets, such as black markets, for the good, and in some cases a decline in the quantity supplied of the good. These are some of the reasons economists use the discouraged. These are some of the reasons why economists used to discourage policymakers from using such policies as price ceilings. It is often more useful to understand why the market price is relatively high, as opposed to trying to just solve it. Is it because demand is high or supply is low? Or is the market working efficiently and the price isn't too high from an economic standpoint? So to take this step by step, without government interference, the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied would be at a market clearing price represented by QE and PE. For whatever reason the policymakers feel it justifiable, government imposes a maximum price of P max in order to help the consumers of bread. At this new mandated low price, also known as a binding price ceiling because it creates a market condition whereby market equilibrium is unachievable, as a consequence of this lower price, there is a lower opportunity cost of consumption, so quantity demanded rises to Q2 as the opportunity cost for production rises at that price, incentivizing producers to cut their production from QE to Q1, thereby creating a shortage in the market. We saw earlier what will happen when there is a government-imposed gas shortage. What would happen to people if there was a bread shortage? The answer, by the way, to the previous question would be the French Revolution. Anyway, if demand and supply are price inelastic, a given price change causes a relatively small change in quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So the market shortage resulting from a price ceiling at PC is very small here. If demand and supply are price elastic, a given price change causes a relatively large change in quantity demanded and quantity supplied. In this case, the market shortage resulting from a binding price ceiling at PC is quite large. Also, just as taxes lead to deadweight loss because they cause quantity to fall, so does a price ceiling. The graph here illustrates how to calculate the impact of price ceilings on the stakeholders in the market. Here, in free market equilibrium, producer surplus is shown by the space in red, while the consumer surplus is shown by the highlighted in yellow. The shortage that we have learned about is the consequence of the binding price ceiling as seen in the difference between QD and QS. Because the market is now producing QS levels of output with a legally mandated minimum price, the opportunity cost of production increases, as shown by the shrinking producer surplus, which is now green. With the lower mandated price, however, the opportunity cost of consumption falls, which expands the consumer surplus to the area now highlighted brown. Since there is a loss of consumer and producer surplus, as seen in the model, society experiences a net loss when a price ceiling is imposed. This is known as the concept of deadweight loss. Although consumers who are able to purchase the good at a reduced price are better off, the losses experienced by sellers and by consumers who are unable to obtain the product outweigh those gains. Price ceilings then do not achieve the professed goal of making an output available at a lower price. Rather, a price ceiling on an output leads to a shortage and a deadweight loss to society. It may also lead to the development of illegal markets for the output, a lower quality of the output, and a higher opportunity cost associated with obtaining the output, like standing in long lines, for example. Other examples of price ceilings includes rent controls, which is where governments may attempt to impose maximum prices on rented accommodations to ensure affordable accommodations for those on low incomes. Another market that experiences price ceilings are agricultural markets, where governments may set maximum prices in agricultural and food markets to ensure low-cost food for poor individuals or low-income individuals. Despite the evidence that price ceilings are harmful to the welfare of society, there are additional ways in which government can continue to intervene in the economy to make the price ceilings work. Notice that this just justifies more government intervention. These government strategies include 1. Produce the product themselves, thus increasing the supply. 2. The government could offer subsidies to the firms in the industry to encourage them to produce more of the product. 3. If the government had previously stored some of the product, like buffer stocks, then they could release some of the stocks into the market. However, if the product were perishable like bread, this would not be possible, as the bread would probably rot prior to entering the market. If the government is able to shift the supply curve to the right by subsidizing, directing provisions toward, or using stored bread, then equilibrium will be reached at P max with Q2 loaves of bread being demanded and supplied. These actions obviously would cause the supply line to shift rightward, which then eliminates the shortage through more government intervention. If the free market price is deemed too low for some sellers in the market, policymakers may decide to set a lower limit on the price that buyers must pay in order to protect those sellers. Think about the political corruption that this would incentivize. A price floor is a minimum legal price for an input or output and is sometimes referred to as a price support. A binding price floor is one that is established above the equilibrium price. It prevents price from falling below the price floor. A price floor set below equilibrium price is non-binding because it does not prevent equilibrium from being achieved. One important example of the price floor is the minimum wage. Again, basic supply and demand analysis can be used to show the potential impact of a price floor or minimum wage in the market for unskilled labor. Suppose supply and demand conditions in the market for unskilled labor can be described by the model shown. The equilibrium wage rate in this market is about $4 per hour. At that wage rate, firms are willing to employ about 1,250 hours of labor services. Workers are willing to supply 1,250 hours of labor services at a wage of $4. So if everyone's okay with it, what's the problem? So every worker who wants a job at the prevailing wage rate is able to find one, and the market is in equilibrium. If policymakers impose a price floor or minimum wage at $5.50 per hour, a market surplus results. At a wage rate of $5.50 per hour, firms are only willing to employ 950 hours of labor services, but workers want to supply 1,400 hours of their services. This discrepancy means that some workers who are seeking employment are not able to find jobs, or if they do find the jobs, they are not able to work as many hours as they would like. A surplus of labor means the labor is not being utilized, which translates to higher unemployment, ceteris paribus. Some students refer to this situation as shortage of jobs. But be careful to use the economic terms correctly. Whenever quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, there is a market surplus or excess quantity supplied. This stuff will make more sense with a model, which we'll get to here in a bit. But first, it should be known that a binding price floor is a minimum price set by the government, which lies above the market equilibrium price and therefore leads to market inefficiency. The government does this with the justification that making the market inefficient will be better for society, like mandating a minimum wage for labor resources benefits those individuals who supply their labor as long as unemployment is unchanging. So for an example, let's take the agricultural market. So usually the supply for agricultural goods is relatively inelastic. That's because fertile soils, arable climate, things like this can't really be supplied in greater quantity with a change in price. So usually the output of agricultural goods is not very responsive to changes in price, so therefore it's more inelastic. But let's say, we really need food. We need food to live. You can't have a country, you can't have an economy without food to keep the people alive. So let's say in order to guarantee that there will be food supplies in the future, the government is going to set a binding price floor for the production of food, as you can see. So here we have the binding price floor, or the minimal price that will be allowed for this market. And at that price, producers of agricultural goods will be incentivized to produce a greater quantity of that price, as you can see from a shift in QE to Q2. But also at that price, consumers of agricultural products would not be as able or not be as willing to consume QE amounts. So quantity demanded would fall to Q1 as a consequence. Therefore, you'd have a surplus of unused agricultural products. Well, guess who's going to purchase that surplus? That's right. Usually the government will purchase the surplus of agricultural products, and they will store that surplus for future use in case of famine or in case of drought, or if there's a war that we don't expect coming, we can use that excess food reserve to feed our troops and that kind of thing. So this is just one way in which a binding price floor can be used in agricultural markets. So other examples include price supports for commodities whose prices are subject to large fluctuations or to protect them from foreign competition, like what's going on right now between the United States and China. Or another example of binding price floors would be the minimum wage set to protect workers and, quote unquote, ensure that they earn enough to lead a reasonable life, because we are the arbiters of what a reasonable life is, apparently. Ceteris paribus, of course. In order to eliminate the surplus that the government policy created, the government can continue to intervene in the economy by buying the surplus, as I said earlier. This leads to an increase in the government's stock of the product, where the product can then be stored, destroyed, exported to other countries, given out as aid, like to Somalia, for instance, or any other options that come about. Price supports means that the government agrees to purchase the excess of the agreed minimum price, again, for whatever reason, whether providing as aid abroad or using to fuel the troops or whatever. But this also means that costs for the government will increase, as the government will have to allocate more of its tax revenue to the construction of silos, to the maintenance costs of those storage units and things like this, which means your taxes might go up. So here's the situation, back to the model, where because of the binding price floor, there is a surplus of agricultural products produced. So here we see that the government is going to be more willing and able to purchase these products, probably as they tax more of the citizenry in order to gain the revenue to purchase the products. But the government will acquire these products, this excess supply, for future use, as we previously specified. This is just what it looks like on the model. So that market equilibrium can be achieved, as you can see in the model. In many cases, such like the cases of wheat, the surplus is burnt, sold on other markets, which is called dumping. China dumps a lot of their steel on U.S. markets, and we can talk about that later, or even sold back to farmers at lower prices, which is then used as feed for their cows or horses, for instance. If demand and supply are price elastic, a given price change can cause a relatively large change in quantity demanded and quantity supplied. In this case, the market surplus resulting from a price floor or price support at PS is large. This means that a minimum wage causes a large amount of unemployment. If demand and supply are price inelastic, a given price change in quantity demanded and quantity supplied, so the market surplus resulting from a price floor or price support at PS is smaller. This means that a minimum wage causes a small amount of unemployment. So as we can see from the model, the minimum wage or binding price floor in labor markets results in higher levels of unemployment. Price floors imposed on commodities, such as like foods and other inputs, will result with taxpayers bearing the burden of this policy, as the economic costs will usually be passed on to them. And also the price rises as usually the amount consumed falls. So here we see a free market situation in which equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity is achieved. As a consequence, consumers and producers are theoretically both benefiting equally through the transaction in this market. However, when a binding price floor is imposed, this gives greater incentive for entrepreneurs to produce a greater amount, or to introduce a greater amount of the product to the market. As the price also rises, the amount of the product or the amount of the commodity that is demanded will fall to QD. And as you can see, this creates a surplus. So as a consequence here, consumer surplus will drastically decline into the blue triangle from originally the yellow triangle. New producer surplus will expand a little bit from the red triangle to the green, whatever shape that is. And what was once consumer and producer surplus now becomes deadweight loss. And again, we've already talked about what deadweight loss is, so I'm not going to rehash that. All right, so here's the basics of the model. Review over this, and I'll see you guys in class. Bye.